All right, good evening, everyone. Our folks out there, can everyone hear me okay? Just doing a quick audio check before we start kicking off our stream tonight. Let's see, got my stream up here. Sounds good. Okay, thank you, Kimtron. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Wesley Sanders. I'm going to be talking today about better understanding PTSD. This is in recognition and support of PTSD Awareness Month. Yesterday was PTSD Awareness Day. And here at Frost Call, it's very important for us to support folks with our mental health mission. So let me get us rolling here. Make sure everything is on mute. Excellent. All right, I want to get rolling. So for those of you who don't know, I go by Terribly Sorry in the Frost Call community, but my name is Wesley Sanders. I'm a psychologist at Homebase. In my day job, I work with veterans doing trauma-focused therapy and other forms of therapy to support veterans and veteran family members. And then in my additional hours, I founded and supported Frost Call, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute. My specialty is in reintegration to civilian life for veterans, as well as trauma-focused therapy and family support, because we know it's not just veterans who might be struggling with mental health needs, but their whole family needs support when the veteran is struggling. I also served in the military myself. I was in the Marine Corps Reserve for 8 years, got out in 2012 as an E5, that's a rank of sergeant. And I'm a gamer. I really enjoy a variety of different games. I've been playing, well, I've been playing Mario Golf actually. So that just came out. So that's my big thing right now is Mario Golf. But tend to be kind of a all-rounder when it comes to video games, and try to dabble in all sorts of different things. All right. So let me check how. Oops. Just one moment. Trying to get the Twitch stream to show up on my phone, and it's really, really fighting me today. There we go. Okay. So a little bit about Frost Call. So Frost Call is a 501c3 nonprofit. We are largely based in the Boston area, but we support veterans all over the country. We are devoted to supporting veterans, service members, reservists, and it's all about community for us. It's all about creating community, bringing veterans together, finding that lost camaraderie that goes missing a little bit after military service, and using gaming as a big conduit. We have gaming events. We do gaming events locally here. We have streams every Friday for our, we call it Barracks Night, where we stream on Twitch. Folks can come out and join us. And we also have in-person events that can range. So it's really anything that can bring veterans together, but gaming tends to be one of our biggest focuses. So we are excited to be able to offer a lot more gaming events. As I'm giving this talk today, a lot of COVID restrictions have begun to lift this summer, and that allows us to provide more support for veterans in the community, which we're very excited about. Our mission is connecting and supporting veterans through a shared passion for gaming. And as I mentioned earlier, among our core values is the importance of community. We also think of Frost Call in a way as a suicide prevention organization, because part of what makes it really challenging for veteran mental health is just feeling like you're alone, like you don't have folks to connect with, and that the civilian community doesn't fully understand or appreciate some of the ways that you see the world after your military experiences. So by bringing folks together, helping to recreate a little bit of that connectivity, we think that goes a long way towards supporting mental health. And in fact, mental health is one of the core pieces of our work, destigmatizing mental health, making it a little bit easier to get access to mental health services, and today giving this presentation on PTSD, just helping to spread awareness and understanding about mental health issues that affect the veteran community. So I'm going to start today by let me take a step back actually. Before we talk about trauma, The goal of today is to talk about PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder in recognition of PTSD Awareness Month. Um, so I'm going to be talking about this from the frame of the veteran, but as I'll talk about a little bit closer to the end of the presentation today, I do want to highlight that PTSD affects everyone, not just veterans. However, there are some military-related experiences that might be more specific to veterans, and of course, we know that veterans do have some significant risk issues around development of PTSD symptoms following deployment experiences. So that's kind of the goal for the presentation today. I also know this is a heavy topic. It's hard to talk about, it's hard to think about. It can be uncomfortable to to explore. Um, this presentation today that I'm giving as a clinical psychologist is not meant to be considered therapy or therapeutic support. It's really meant to be informational. If you do feel like you might be in a state of crisis or worried about your safety or just not sure who to contact, the Veterans Crisis Line, which is veteranscrisisline.net, they have many ways to access them. They are great crisis support. They're available 24/7. You can find their website at veteranscrisisline.net. You can find their phone number on the website, and you can even text them for support. So that's a great avenue of support that's specific to veterans, in addition to, of course, 911 and other emergency services. So please access those if you feel like you need them. But I also recognize this can be a challenging talk, and I appreciate everyone who made the time to participate today. Okay. So, before we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, I think it's important for us to talk about the T part of PTSD. So, what is trauma? So, when we think about a traumatic event as we describe it in the context of PTSD, it really has a specific definition. And so, when I say definition, I mean definition in terms of like a diagnostic criteria of sorts. And when we talk about traumatic events, one of the key elements that is present in something that is considered a traumatic event is death. Death is somewhere in the picture. If you've heard the phrase near death experience, life or death, something where our well being is threatened, our life might be on the line, or our safety might be threatened severely. So this could be experiencing something where we are afraid we might die in that situation, or we might witness someone else going through that experience, or witness someone who actually did die, or witnessing death itself. Um, in some instances, indirectly learning about death can be traumatic. Now, I want to offer the caveat here that finding out about a celebrity death in the news, for example, would not be considered something traumatic. It needs to be something that is very personal, very close. Um, this could also be something like witnessing repeated images or videos of traumatic experiences. So, for people who have to kind of scan through online material that might be illicit, that can be traumatizing over time. Or serving in a military role where you're, even though you're not physically present for um, the combat encounters, witnessing them repeatedly over video feeds or things like that can also be traumatic. So death in some way is part of the traumatic event or the traumatic experience. It's not required, but very often there's also a combination of this threat to our safety as well as a feeling of helplessness or a loss of control. So this can be a literal feeling of helplessness. So for example, if a Humvee hits an IED, the vehicle rolls over, or there's an explosion, and you're pinned down, you're taking small arms fire, and you're not able to fire back. That feeling of literal helplessness because you are physically unable to respond to a threat to your life can be severely traumatizing. And in some instances, it can also be that disconnect of not being able to stop something from happening. Maybe you didn't leave the fob that day, and someone else took your spot, and that inability to be able to prevent that person's death that might have happened during the deployment can be a loss of help, a loss of control as well. Lastly, trauma is something that evokes an intense emotional response. So this might not always be something that is visibly noticeable to others, but there is an intense emotional, particularly physiologically emotional response to this experience. So why did I want to highlight the definition of trauma here? Well, it's actually important because this experience can uniquely affect the brain. And to illustrate this, I have a little visual of the human brain. I think it's showing up okay on here. Um, this area on the screen here that is highlighted in purple, this is what's called the prefrontal cortex. So this is the area of your brain that's responsible for what's called higher order thinking. You can think of it as like the tip of the spear from an evolutionary perspective. This is the part of the brain that allows you to start to anticipate consequences, to think about your future a little bit, to kind of anticipate something you need to work on. If you make a grocery list or you start planning your day, you're using your prefrontal cortex. Um, Adolescence, one of the challenges with being an adolescent is that the last part of your brain to develop is actually this prefrontal cortex. So adolescents might be able to start to reason or abstractly think about certain concepts, but without that prefrontal cortex, they're more prone to making impulsive decisions, which is why if any of you have teenagers in the home with you or kind of aware of what that experience was like when you were a teenager, it's that sometimes that kind of inability to and think about some of those consequences that can almost seem kind of like, how did I not anticipate that in hindsight? So what's interesting is that there's been evidence to show that this part of our brain that allows us to make decisions and think about different consequences actually deactivates in the context of a traumatic event. And what activates instead is this subcortical area of the brain called the amygdala. So the amygdala is also known as the fear center of our brain, which is kind of fascinating because for all other emotions, for the most part, they're not housed in one central location. They're kind of split up, so to speak, among different parts of the brain. But the amygdala, that fear center of our brain, has its own special place because of how critical it is as an emotional response for our survival. You can think about this process as kind of like your brain going into battery saver mode. So when your smartphone or your cell phone goes into battery saver mode, what typically happens is it lowers the resolution of your screen. It reduces the capacity to access certain battery drains like different apps, Candy Crush, YouTube, things like that. And it streamlines it so it only is capable of making phone calls, just keeping that battery alive a little bit longer so you can serve those core functions of the phone. Your brain kind of does the same thing during a traumatic event. You don't want to be thinking about 50 possible options when you're in a life or death situation. You need to respond as quickly as possible. So the amygdala kind of takes over here as a means to reduce that need to think about 50 possible options and really streamline it to the fastest, simplest response possible. This is where many of you might have heard of this before. This concept of fight, flight, or freeze comes into play. Now, these are biological responses, meaning that it's not like a drop-down box and you choose one. These are responses that simply happen and almost instantaneously happen as a survival urge kicks in our brain. So it's just like that. It's meant to be as fast as possible for the purposes of keeping us alive. Now, a lot of folks, I think, recognize fight or flight and why that can be adaptive. Freeze tends to be a little bit trickier, and some folks really get caught up on this. In fact, there's some misconceptions about freeze as kind of reflective of some sort of cowardice or moral failure or something kind of like inherently wrong with someone if they engage in the freeze response. But in fact, it is just as adaptive in certain contexts as fight or flight. It's why it's one of the primal biological survival responses. Uh, you could think about being attacked by a grizzly bear. Fighting obviously won't do any good if you don't have a firearm with you, and running could increase your risk. Sometimes playing dead or freezing can be adaptive. When it comes to the military, for Vietnam veterans, for example, you're taught when you're marching through the jungle at night and a flare goes up to freeze because the human eye is drawn to movement. So, increased movement without knowing what you're in for could increase your risk for harm, just as having a firearm pointed at you point blank and trying to move can increase your risk for harm. And while I think it's obviously very important for us to respond to our military training, and in fact, that actually is the purpose of this training is to override these responses so that they're instantly accessible. Our urge to survive has been coming along with us for the entirety of human evolution, and it is a very strong impulse. Sticking your head up above cover to fire back at an enemy sometimes takes defying that survival response that tells you to stay put because you're increasing your risk for harm in some of the situations where, as a military service member, you are taught to react in a way that might be different from that. So, up to this point, we've talked about trauma and the brain in the context of what happens during a traumatic event. After a traumatic event, when the threat has passed, the adrenaline starts draining from our body. We start kind of feeling that exhaustion as our body kind of comes back online, our brain kind of comes back online, so to speak. We're exiting that survival mode and we're trying to understand what the heck just happened here. Before I talk about how we get from this experience to post-traumatic stress disorder, I wanted to first talk a little bit about how memories are formed. And so this is a very simplistic description, so please bear with me, but just wanted to kind of illustrate the concept. When you think about a positive memory, so setting aside trauma for a minute, think about a really positive memory in your life. Maybe a really special birthday, or going to see a band play that you've always wanted to see, or the birth of your child or your wedding day. When these events happen, you can think of it like forming a memory balloon in your brain. The memory itself is the balloon, and the incredible positive emotions that you have are like the helium that fills up that balloon. Now, that balloon kind of bobs up into our consciousness. We're thinking about it. So, after that show that you saw, that really great band play, or after the wedding day, now you're still thinking about it, right? You're still processing that memory. You get a card in the mail congratulating you on the wedding or the birth of the child, or you see something on YouTube that reminds you of that special day. That memory balloon is activated again. It comes back up with those positive emotions. It's buoyed up to the surface over and over and over again. And after some period of time, that memory doesn't really come up to the surface anymore. It starts to kind of deflate. We still can access the memory, but we're not feeling that same level of positive emotions at the same level, I should say, as during those really positive experiences. So the balloon kind of deflates. It comes back down. It's no longer popping up in our consciousness. We don't think about it every day. If you have a special date like a wedding day or the birth of a child and it's happened some years ago, you don't necessarily think about it on a daily basis, but it's still there. It's ready to be accessed. We call this consolidated. This is when the memory gets stored away in that filing cabinet. We can pull it back out whenever we want, but it's not bubbling up into our consciousness every single day. This is the process of a memory being formed and becoming a long-term memory. Now, sometimes memories aren't inherently positive. Maybe they're just really boring. If you've ever studied for a test, if you ever had to memorize something by reading it over and over and over again, it's like a balloon with no helium in it. You're purposely pulling up that balloon into your consciousness to think about it over and over again until it becomes stored away so that you can access it at a later time. Well, what about a trauma memory? After we had a near-death experience, the brain has to go through this process as well. It's filled with this amazing amount of helium, just like these memories I described here. But in the case of a traumatic memory, that helium is filled with fear or terror or some sort of really strong negative emotions that were evoked that day. And there's a string attached. So when a trauma memory comes up filled with that helium of fear or anxiety or sadness, it also has the string dangling off of it so that when we have that memory of that traumatic experience reactivated, we also sometimes feel incredible amounts of fear, or our heart rate goes up. Our breathing might get really shallow or rapid. We start feeling kind of panicky or sweaty. Sometimes it feels like someone's kind of sitting on us. It's hard to breathe. It can be so disorienting that our body might even be confused into thinking that the thing that we remembered is actually happening all over again. So that memory can be really vivid, and sometimes we don't even know it's a memory. It feels like it's really happening all over again. As you can imagine, this is not a pleasant feeling. It can invoke terror and fear. It can be really hard to experience. And the natural human urge to respond to these memories is to try to get away from it. We engage in some form of avoidance. Maybe we distract ourselves. Maybe we use substances to try to stop the memories from coming up. Um, Maybe we try to stay away from anything that brings up the memory. So, stay off Facebook because we don't want to see a post that pops up from a friend who died. And up to this point, everything that I'm describing so far does not mean that someone who goes through this process has post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, nearly everyone who experiences a traumatic event goes through this whole process. We have a traumatic experience, it comes up in a shocking way in our thinking. We tolerate it for as long as we might be able to, and then we try to distract ourselves and engage in avoidance. And slowly but surely, bit by bit, that memory starts to deflate a little bit, just like those other memories that I described. And in addition, that string starts to fall away so that the memory might come up in the future without bringing up that confusing physical piece that makes us wonder if it's really happening all over again. Where this differs from post-traumatic stress disorder is that one way post-traumatic stress disorder can develop is when we get really good at avoidance. So if we start to change our lives to accommodate our avoidance to such an extreme level that we prevent that memory from being able to get processed, then what starts to happen is that balloon, you can almost think of like more like a beach ball where it's kind of pushed below the surface. We're sitting on this beach ball in this pool, and all it takes is one sudden movement and the beach ball shoots up above the water again, and then we're pushing it back down. So the trauma memory never deflates. We're still trying to access that avoidance, and we start to get caught in a cycle. This cycle is really kind of one of the core pieces of post-traumatic stress disorder. We're trying desperately to get away from this memory. And in fact, our efforts to keep away from it actually, in some ways, can help perpetuate it, unfortunately. So this memory doesn't really have a chance to get stored away or processed. Our avoidance isn't adequately reducing all of that shock of it coming up here or there, and we kind of get caught. So up to this point, I've actually described to you two of four groups of symptoms of PTSD. The first group of symptoms are what are called intrusions. These are that balloon that I described with that helium. That balloon kind of bubbles up to the surface, and it can bubble up to the surface for all sorts of reasons. Maybe you're browsing Facebook and you see a picture that reminds you of something. Maybe you're watching a war movie and there's some elements of it that remind you of a combat deployment. Maybe there is a depiction of sexual assault in a TV show, or some discussion that comes up that reminds you of some of those experiences. And when that does, that balloon can kind of barge into our consciousness. Suddenly we're thinking about it. Certain smells or noises can also bring up that memory balloon as well. And when it does, it tends to bring that string attached, like I mentioned, the string of physiological impacts. So that could be the heart racing, the shallow breathing, the sweatiness, as well as an emotional impact. We can feel intense fear or confusion or anxiety or sadness or disgust or anger, other strong emotions. This can also look like what's called a flashback. So many of you might have heard of the term flashback, but flashback really simply means when that memory balloon starts to become so vivid that we confuse the memory for reality. And sometimes we get kind of sucked back into time, so to speak, where we feel like we're really there reliving an experience for a moment. This can also come up in the form of nightmares. In fact, sleep and sleep difficulties are extremely common with PTSD. Most of the treatments that we have for PTSD in terms of medications often directly try to treat the sleep challenges. Because as we go to sleep, our brain then finally has that release to start processing some of the memories of the day, as well as some past memories. And of course, this can mean that the memories of a traumatic experience come up and barge into our consciousness. So we might wake up in a sweat or kick in our sleep or jump out of bed because that memory can be so intense. The other piece, as I mentioned earlier, is our avoidance. So our avoidance can take the form of external avoidance or internal avoidance. So external avoidance would be things like things in our environment, so to speak, that trigger that memory. So staying away from bridges because driving over bridges was dangerous in the military. Staying away from crowded areas or busy spaces because if that feeling we get that something bad's going to happen, that danger feeling starts to get really overpowering. Avoiding sitting in an aisle where we can't instantly escape or always backing our car into a parking spot. Uh, Anything that we do to try to stay away from the reactivation of that fear or that danger feeling. We can also avoid certain noises or smells, or just the concept of feeling trapped or stuck. All of these things aren't inherently uh, diagnostic, like doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be able to not do these things to be considered um, not having any challenges with PTSD. It's really more about kind of the having to do these things, having kind of the rigidity of maintaining these avoidance strategies because they can be so distressing. We can also avoid in our own mind the memories of a traumatic experience. So, things that we do to try to avoid thinking about something traumatic, staying away from conversations or distracting ourselves, staying really busy all the time, always at work 24/7, never stop moving, using substances like drugs or alcohol to try to numb our brain or to fall asleep without having dreams. These are all things that we might be doing to avoid thinking about or discussing the traumatic experience. So those are two of the four symptoms of PTSD. Another of the four symptoms of PTSD is reflective of our body's threat detection system. So we call this the arousal symptom cluster because it reflects our body's kind of awareness and quick to jump to respond to potential threats. So maybe some of you listening to this talk have heard of the concept of hypervigilance before. This one gets a little bit confusing because a lot of folks kind of equate any vigilance as hypervigilance, but that's not necessarily the case. Remember, there's vigilance and then there's hypervigilance. So hypervigilance is kind of a rigidity, like feeling like I have to maintain a certain protocol of safety behaviors, even if it doesn't actually match the risk of threat in a situation. So if you've been with a loved one or if you yourself have found yourself kind of fixating on coming up with disaster preparedness plans that might not reflect the actual likelihood of a certain disaster happening, if you feel distracted from eating your food at a restaurant or the conversation of a loved one because you're so focused on maintaining that perimeter, looking out for danger, having our eye on all the exits, always having our back to a wall, that might be reflective of hypervigilance symptoms. The body isn't really meant to sustain this level of vigilance 24/7. Even in the military, you never had to maintain a 360 perimeter for the most part. You usually had other service members with you. There was the deployed environment and the garrison environment. So you get back to base, you get back stateside, you are able to reduce some of that vigilance as well. It's not something that our body is meant to maintain for the rest of our lives. So what can start to happen is our body starts to break down if we try to maintain this hypervigilance all the time. We can be really easily startled because our body is kind of hair triggered for some sort of threat to come up. Our concentration kind of gets wrecked. It's really hard to focus when maybe even 60%, if I'm being generous, of our energy is devoted to maintaining that constant awareness. That's still only 40% you have left to do everything else in your life. Our sleep obviously takes a big hit because it's hard to sleep comfortably if we're constantly on alert and unable to let our guard down. And of course, irritability, right? Feeling kind of pissed off all the time, angry, frustrated, very quick to snap at others, very quick to jump to that, level 10 response because you feel like you have to be able to. That's part of what the training in the military oftentimes encourages, is that quick reaction uh, factor there. Unfortunately, it can lead to a lot of frustration with loved ones and ourselves when we're kind of stuck in that cycle. I'll also mention too the top symptom here of recklessness or self-destructive behavior. So this would be things oftentimes trying to simulate in some ways our traumatic experiences, or sometimes just trying to feel almost feeling safer in a traumatic environment. So if you've ever felt yourself or talked with others about like just wanting to be back in the deployed environment again, there's that feeling of control, knowing that at least the job that we're doing over there that's dangerous, we have some training for, and then we have some support around. And in a very real sense, there's experiences that you have in a deployed environment that you never have again as a civilian. So that if we are on stateside, if you're riding a motorcycle 125 miles per hour on the freeway, if you're engaging in behavior that could harm yourself or your family with like spending behavior or things like that, those can be some potentially destructive symptoms that are reflective of our body's kind of uh, overindulging in that kind of like arousal response at times. All right, so this fourth cluster of symptoms here is a little bit bigger. You'll notice there's kind of a longer list on here to talk about, and that's because this captures the negative beliefs and mood impact of PTSD. So if the arousal symptoms are about kind of the body's kind of response to trauma, the negative beliefs and mood are more about the mind's response to trauma. So our mind does different things to try to cope. Sometimes there might be memory gaps of things that have happened that don't reflect some sort of brain damage, but simply our brains attempt to try to block off some painful memories themselves. Sometimes we're trying to make sense of what happened. So we're constantly reprocessing and thinking about it, and maybe we come out of those experiences with some views about ourselves or about other people or about the world that don't totally fit all the facts in front of us. We try to come up with reasons why we could have prevented it, for example, that don't always make total sense, but are born out of a strong desire to think about the possibility that there could have been something we might have been able to do to prevent it. So self-blame is one of the other symptoms. It can come up a lot where we blame ourselves or we can blame others and really struggle getting stuck in that cycle of blame in general. One of the symptoms here that you might not recognize is called anhedonia. So if you think about hedonism as the pursuit of pleasure, anhedonia is the inability to get pleasure. So if you go fishing or if you're out with your friends or if you're with the family and you feel kind of hollow or empty and you're doing something you normally like to do, but you just can't get any enjoyment out of it, we call that anhedonia. There's also detachment from others, feeling like you're alone even when you're in a group of people, and unable to kind of relate or feel connected. Feeling, some people describe it as feeling emotionally numb, just not being able to experience really any emotions or maybe particularly positive emotions. That numbness, combined with all of those other symptoms that we've talked about earlier, can be really discouraging. Here, too, is where symptoms of depression are really common along with PTSD. And it makes sense, right? A lot of these things we're talking about here sound a little bit like depression, especially if we get caught in this loop, if we start to feel like we can't get out of it, if we're really stuck on blaming ourselves and getting kind of fixated on directing our negative emotions inward. Um, this is where sometimes thoughts of suicide can come up. Um, and as I bring up that topic, I think it's important to know that um, talking with a loved one about thoughts of suicide, if you're worried about them, does not increase their risk for suicide. It can only help you to know a little bit more about their experience. The Veterans Crisis Line, veteranscrisisline.net, as I mentioned, is a great resource because you can contact them for support if you're not sure what to do with these thoughts. A lot of people, when they experience thoughts of suicide, oftentimes feel really shocked and kind of scared by those thoughts because it feels so unusual. And so it's a good sign, a major red flag that talking to someone is really necessary at that point. Whether you reach out to a friend or family member, call the VA, call 911, or call the Veterans Crisis Line, it's important to start talking about it and reach out and get that additional support that you might need. If you are a loved one of a veteran or someone who's struggling with PTSD symptoms, um, you can actually call the Veterans Crisis Line for veteran suicidal thoughts, even though you're not the veteran yourself. So a family member can call this line and say, "Hey, I'm really worried about my loved one. They served in the military. I think they might be struggling with suicidal thoughts." And the Veterans Crisis Line can help give you that support too to figure out how to help the veteran. So it's also helpful for family members to have a hold of too. Really good resource. I'll make one last note. If you have a loved one who's a veteran and you're worried about their safety, but you don't live with them or you're not living anywhere nearby to come check on them yourself, you can call the local police department to do a wellness check where they come and knock on the door, make sure that the veteran is doing okay. Um, what I'll say about that is I have not met a single veteran who likes to have the police knock on their door unannounced to check on their safety. So it can be a very distressing and tense situation for everyone involved. It's not ideal, but it is still better sometimes than the alternative of simply doing nothing. So it's a good thing to just kind of keep in the back pocket and recognize that you have that option as well. Okay. So far we have talked about all the four symptoms of PTSD. We talked about the intrusion balloon. We talked about that urge to avoid. We talked about the negative beliefs and mood that can develop. And we talked about that threat detection system that can become very sensitive after a traumatic experience. So I wanted to talk a little bit about two what are called evidence-based therapies for PTSD. So when I say evidence-based therapies, what I mean is that these have been tested in randomized clinical trials. These are the most rigorous form of medical trials that we have for the testing of different therapeutic treatments, and that these have both been found to be efficacious for the treatment of PTSD. That does not mean that they will quote unquote cure PTSD. We can talk about that in a little bit, that they are the perfect fit for everyone. But these two have been shown to be very helpful. And in my personal work with veterans can be in some cases transformative um, and how they change our views and our experience with our traumatic memories. So, okay, so we have all four of these symptoms up on the screen here right now. Um, let's think about the first evidence-based therapy. And this first therapy takes a look at these four symptoms and says, okay, so I know that my intrusion balloons, when they come up to the surface, kind of create that urgency to avoid. And it gets me caught in this cycle of avoiding the memory and preventing it from being able to get processed. I know that my hypervigilance is partly born out of this desire to be on the lookout for anything that might trigger some of that feeling of threat. And so it's kind of reinforced by my avoidance. And I also know that getting caught in this loop over time, over and over again, has built up these negative beliefs and mood symptoms of depression or feeling hopeless or feeling emotionally numb. So, this therapeutic approach argues that if we want to change these symptoms, to reduce these symptoms, the best and really simplest place to start is over with that cycle of intrusions and avoidance. So the goal here is to stop that cycle of intrusions and avoidance, to actually break the cycle. We call this form of therapy prolonged exposure therapy because, as you can guess, if we don't push that balloon down below the surface, it means exposing ourselves to the balloon to actually sit with that memory for a certain period of time. This therapeutic approach has two pieces to it, but both pieces have the same goal. The goal is something called habituation. When we expose ourselves to the memory over and over and over again, it starts to lose its power over us. We are no longer living in fear of that balloon coming up and bubbling up to the surface. We start to get used to the memory and begin to recognize that it is a memory and it is not the real thing happening all over again. So if you remember that balloon, that string attached, the goal here is to kind of take away that string and to deflate the balloon so that we can still access the memory. It's still a painful memory. It's still hard to think about at times, but it no longer evokes that panic feeling, that intense distress that keeps us always on edge, always looking out for that memory. This form of therapy takes a two-pronged approach. One approach is in the present, and one approach is in the past. The form of the present therapy is what's called in vivo, which is Latin for in life. And this form of therapy really focuses on exposing ourselves to the things in our environment that tend to trigger that feeling of danger associated with our memory. So, sitting with our back not against the wall, maybe our back to an entrance of a place that is unquestionably safe, and allowing our arousal symptoms to start to come down and kind of recalibrate to recognize our safety. Or being able to eventually go to sporting events or listen to fireworks or um, watch content that might have, like military representations in it. All of this involves us going out and trying to encounter these things at low levels, getting a little bit used to it, and then building up our tolerance. You can think of this kind of like going to a mental gym. You don't go into the gym and pick up the heaviest weights to get strong. You start with the smaller weights, you build comfort with them, and then you start adding more and more weights until we can start experiencing anything in our life that we wanted to be able to access that we used to be able to do more comfortably. So how do we keep track of this? Well, we use a system called subjective units of distress. Subjective meaning it's up to your own interpretation, and that distress really reflecting that fight, flight, or freeze I described earlier. So it's kind of like a scale that you would use at the doctor's office for pain. The doctor can't see your pain, so you tell them on a 0 to 10 scale how much pain you're feeling in that moment. The SUDS, the subjective units of distress scale, are your report of how distressed you are in a certain situation. And the goal with in vivo therapy is to start at a low level of distress and start to habituate or get used to it and kind of build up over there. Imaginal exposure is going into the past. So if in vivo is the present, imaginal exposure is the past. Here, this is something that you would do with your individual therapist one-on-one, not just talking about some of the elements of what happened, but kind of purposefully invoking that balloon. So instead of waiting for it to barge out of nowhere, like an intrusion, kind of grabbing that string, holding on to it, talking through the memory, facing our fears, sitting with it, and allowing it to deflate over time. So if doing this with a therapist, the goal is to really kind of sit with those suds, let them come up and peak, and then let the suds come back down, that distress level to go back down. Makes it over time start to become less and less distressing. And if we're no longer living in fear of the memory, it also makes it easy to go out into our environment and encounter things that might bring up the memory because we're not worried about bringing up the memory. We don't have to avoid to stay safe because we know that we are safe, that it is just a memory. This form of therapy also often uses recordings as homework, so listening to the imaginal exposure for homework as a means to have an additional chance for that habituation. And this can work really well in really short periods of time. It is challenging. It is something that you have to talk with your therapist to see if this is the good fit for you, but can also be very effective in the treatment of PTSD. Okay, so we've talked about prolonged exposure therapy. This next therapeutic approach focuses more on the negative beliefs and mood section of the spectrum here. And for example, if you look over with this negative belief example that I described, so sometimes after having multiple or even just one combat deployment or military experience, we might have this conclusion, you know what? People don't understand how dangerous it is out there. You could die at any time. The world is dangerous. This belief, if we believe this belief as being completely true, implies that there is no safety whatsoever in the world at any time. And if I believe this, I'm not going to change my hypervigilance because I have to keep that up to stay safe. I could die at any time. I'm not going to change my avoidance because why would I expand my perimeter when that increases my likelihood of being killed or hurt? And of course, that keeps those intrusions in place because I'm not facing some of those things that might be evoking my concerns and my fears. So that belief can kind of keep us stuck. And with this form of therapy, we actually call them stuck points because they can keep us in this cycle of symptoms. This form of therapy is called cognitive processing therapy. And cognitive meaning our thinking, processing meaning to challenge our thinking. So I'll give you another example here. A lot of times when we are trying to understand why something traumatic happened to us, we fall back on our ways of understanding the world from our childhood. And a very common belief that many, if not most of us, are told at some point in our childhood is if you do good things will happen to you. But if you act up or if you act bad, you're going to get in trouble. Something bad will happen to you. We don't usually tell our kids, for example, that if you're going to um, act up, that sometimes you're going to get away with it. We usually convey this in kind of simple rules. If you do good, good things will happen. If you do bad, you're going to get in trouble or bad things will happen. So, what does that mean if something traumatic happens to us? If something terrible happens to us? If I was raised to believe that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, and something horrific happens to me, one conclusion we might lean towards is I'm a bad person. I deserve this to happen to me. Or we might start to say, what did I do wrong? What did I do that was my fault to make this happen to me? We look for reasons to blame ourselves kind of as a starting place. And this can be so compelling that sometimes we just blame ourselves for living. If you've heard of the term survivor's guilt, sometimes we feel guilty just for surviving when other people have not. Those beliefs, the shame, the guilt, those emotions that we lay upon ourselves on top of the traumatic experience can be incredibly disabling. It can be hard to really give ourselves permission to do anything or make any changes. And that really is where cognitive processing therapy can be very effective and supportive, is helping veterans to be able to challenge their conclusions around some of these experiences because we know we're prone towards assuming blame or laying on uh, more blame than might be reasonably applied from some of our traumatic experiences. So this form of therapy is all about challenging our thinking, examining our thinking, not just talking about what happened, but trying to understand what do we tell ourselves about why it happened. It's my fault if I had just done this, if I hadn't done that, if I had told this person, if I had just been there. Coulda, woulda, shouldas that we come up with. Those can be incredibly distressing. And being able to challenge those is the core goal of cognitive processing therapy. It's not about thinking happy thoughts. This is not a thing where it's, goodwill hunting, it's not your fault, kind of thing, repeating over and over again. You have to come to the conclusion. You have to understand it in a way that makes sense to you, and you have to challenge the ways of thinking that you've had up to this point. But it's a balanced form of thinking that can be incredibly helpful and give us that capacity to start to make some space in our traumatic uh, symptoms. So to come back to this for a minute, if I can acknowledge that I can be safe sometimes in some situations with some people, then what that means is that I can reduce my hypervigilance in some situations, that I can reduce my avoidance in some situations. And now I've given myself some flexibility to be able to make some changes in my life. But I can only make that change if I recognize that I can be safe sometimes and I'm willing to allow myself to do so. This form of therapy involves a lot of insight building and awareness building, so worksheets are a very common component for cognitive processing therapy. Okay, so before we turn over to questions, um, I wanted to briefly talk about some family considerations and then talk a little bit about what we do at Frost Call to help support veterans and their mental health. These are some common challenges that a lot of family members face when their loved one is struggling with PTSD symptoms. So, trust can be really difficult when it comes to post traumatic stress disorder. Our trust can be ruptured. We might not trust ourselves. A lot of veterans might struggle with the idea of just trusting their own emotions, feeling like they're going to lose control of their emotions, or feeling like other people won't be able to tolerate their emotions. If we've lost someone in our traumatic experience, then allowing ourselves to be vulnerable can be really difficult because being vulnerable means the possibility of being harmed. And sometimes our ways of thinking about this are very black and white. I either trust you or I don't trust you. But that's not really how it works, right? We don't just trust or not trust. We might trust someone to borrow $5, but we wouldn't trust them with experiencing some of our strong emotions. Or we might trust another person to experience some of our difficult feelings with us, but we wouldn't necessarily expect them to show up on time if they were giving us a ride somewhere. We have different levels of trust with different people, and that can be really disrupted by PTSD because it can be hard to recognize that when we're struggling. There's also anger as avoidance. What do I mean by that? Well, anger is an emotion that is encouraged in the military. It's the only emotion that you're kind of allowed to have. It's trained, it's reinforced. Sometimes it's actually even more comfortable because it's an emotion that involves some sort of usefulness, right? I can direct my anger towards overcoming an obstacle. I can't do the same thing with sadness in the same way. So, anger can be a compelling emotion to try to redirect our energy towards. It can feel more comfortable than shame or guilt or disgust or sadness. Those emotions can feel sometimes unbearable. And so, if you have a loved one, or if you yourself have ever noticed that you find yourself getting angry at things that really aren't that important to get angry about, but it can feel almost kind of safer when there are other emotions below the surface, it's because anger can feel almost like an avoidance emotion at times. That it's easier to kind of sit with anger or to kind of create something to be angry about than to kind of go back to some of those raw emotions. Thank you, Anna. I love the bits in the chat. Thank you. Um, And then lastly, this idea that civilians can't understand. Now, it's true that some civilians may never understand experiences of a military service member, that they may never be able to relate to it. But part of the trap of this form of thinking is that it kind of becomes globalized, where it's like civilians can't understand my deployment, therefore they can't understand my mental health, therefore they can't be able to help me, therefore I can't talk to them about anything. And it starts to become like all inclusive, and we just wall off from our loved ones. But the truth is that maybe our loved ones, civilians, can understand difficult emotions, or they can understand what it means to feel hurt, even if they can't understand our specific experiences that have brought those about. And so it can start to develop kind of like a wall between us and our loved ones, which really can make the PTSD symptoms even harder to manage. It has a big impact on our family as well. So I just wanted to touch on those because I know that for those who are listening who might not be a veteran yourself but are interested in a loved one who has struggled with these symptoms, they can have an impact on our family as well. And it really speaks to the importance of making sure the whole family is getting support when a loved one is getting care and help for PTSD symptoms. Okay, so I wanted to pause here and I'm looking down at the stream and see if anyone in the chat has any questions. Um, I'm gonna go over a couple questions that we got in advance of the presentation today. So I'll go over and kind of talk about some of these questions while I wait. But if you have questions that you want answered, just pop in the chat here and let me know what you want me to speak to. I am not, by the way, an MD, just as a reminder. I'm a PhD, so I know about some of the medication services for PTSD, but I'm not a prescriber and can't speak to kind of specific doses or things like that. I can speak to the behavioral uh, health treatments of PTSD. Okay, so we got one question from our Discord was about um, cannabis use for PTSD. So this is something that has been really tricky because for those who don't know, because cannabis is not federally legalized, even if it is in the states, and the VA healthcare systems are, it's a federal system. A lot of times, being able to use marijuana is something that can actually get in the way of mental health care at the VA. There have been some positive changes towards that in terms of accommodating, but one of the biggest challenges with cannabis use is because of the way that it's regulated for research. There's actually not been a lot of research looking at it and its impact on PTSD. A lot of veterans use cannabis, particularly for sleep difficulties, as kind of like a side effect of PTSD. So there's some evidence, for example, it might help reduce um, nightmares, traumatic nightmares. Um, so the benefit is being able to kind of get more sleep, get more restful sleep, feeling calmer when you go to sleep. Um, the challenge there is that there's also some evidence that when you are using cannabis to manage some of those symptoms, that it can enhance some of the sleep difficulties as soon as you stop. So it almost makes it kind of hard then to go to sleep if you do stop using cannabis um, after some time of habituation to it. So that's a little bit about it. I know I'm going to offer the big caveat that it is because of the restricted research, there's just a lot we don't know about how it affects sleep and then how it kind of wraps into PTSD. Um, looks like we get another question here from the chat. Thinking specifically about the ways that families can support a veteran struggling with reintegration and PTSD. Logically, families also make mistakes in their support. What advice do you have to initiate a repair when a family member invalidates or misunderstands? What's a good starting point? So this is a good question. So it sounds like with this one, it's kind of like when family members are trying to support a loved one, how can they initiate a repair if they misunderstand? So there's a couple different factors here. Part of it kind of depends on the relationship that you have with your loved one. So, if this is a family member I'm talking to, for example, trying to talk with your loved one who's a veteran from a place of compassion and understanding, and also kind of just openness to understanding more, recognizing that you had a misunderstanding or weren't fully aware, and expressing an interest in learning more and being able to listen empathically, that can be helpful. My experience in working with veterans is they often feel like they've been struggling with these symptoms for some time, and maybe there's some kind of
burnout from their loved one who is kind of only really seeing the outcome, which is all of the hurt and pain and suffering that can come up from some of these symptoms, and they don't necessarily understand the why. So trying to create a space where the two of you can talk about the why a little bit could be helpful there. Um, Asking about ways to kind of support one another can be great. I'll kind of share here that one of the challenges we talked about earlier is avoidance, right? And sometimes, as loved ones, our efforts to help reduce the distress of our veteran who's struggling with PTSD symptoms can accidentally reinforce avoidance. So, for example, if we take over all the chores and we're the only ones that leave the house, then that might be reinforcing avoidance for our veteran loved one. So, trying to have an open conversation about supporting without reinforcing that avoidance can be helpful. If your veteran is in care, seeing a mental health provider, it can be really helpful for them to talk to the mental health provider and say, hey, can I bring in my loved one for one session just to kind of like explain what's going on? Using a mental health provider to explain, just like I did today, some of the symptoms, the treatment, not having to go in any detail about your specific traumatic experience, but just helping to get that loved one a little bit more understanding about PTSD. That can be a great way to do it because then you got a third party here who is kind of going over some of those issues as well. And then, of course, if the relationship is at a level where it's really hard to communicate, and actually some of the biggest challenges are just that that communication cycle has become so disrupted that it's really hard to even start. A couples therapist or someone who can help you to mend the communication could be a good way to try to build back up so that you can get to a space where you can have these kinds of conversations. Good question. Let me know if that answers your question, by the way. I'm happy to expand on that a little bit as well. Awesome. Um, So another question that I've had from folks in the past is about treating veterans depending on the number of years that they've been struggling with PTSD. So some folks think that with PTSD, if you've had post-traumatic stress symptoms for many, many years, that it means that you are kind of incurable or unhelpable, or there's really not much that you can benefit from in terms of trauma-focused therapy. And what I would say to that is, from my personal experience working with veterans, that's not necessarily true. Um, I've done some incredibly awesome work with Vietnam veterans who've maybe struggled with PTSD symptoms for 50 years, 60 years. Um, and being able to uh, help folks like that tells me that these therapies can be efficacious even for folks who've struggled with these symptoms for a very long time. So the duration the of time since the traumatic event does not necessarily mean um, that these therapies will not be effective. They can be very effective for folks as well. This actually brings up another question that I get asked a lot, which is the quote unquote cure question around treatments for PTSD. So there are some camps of veterans out there who kind of believe, if I have PTSD symptoms, then nothing will change. I have to kind of just cope with it for the rest of my life. Others might be asking, like, is there a cure, something that kind of gets rid of it that will kind of transform me back to the way I was, whatever that might be, before my military experience. And the reason why a lot of providers shy away from the word cure is because it's such a loaded term. Like, what is a cure, right? In my mind, a cure would be having absolutely no symptoms whatsoever of anything related to PTSD. The challenge there is that this is still a traumatic memory. It is always going to be painful. It would be reasonable if that when you think about this experience years from now, even if you've done some really great work in therapy, that you still find it hard to sit with sometimes, or that you still feel sad on the anniversary of the death of someone you care about. So if that's something that's coming up, that doesn't mean that you are not doing well or that PTSD treatment failed you. It simply means that the goal here is to be able to reduce these symptoms to a level that is comfortable to function and to be able to do what you want to live, where you don't have to develop kind of external support systems to cope with those symptoms, that you can naturally cope with them after processing and being able to habituate to some of those memories. Um, the last question I'll talk about is there a particular kind of trauma that these therapies work best with? So the answer is no. that these interventions have been found helpful for combat trauma, for interpersonal trauma, meaning some sort of inflicted trauma from another person versus like an kind of like a natural disaster or something where a person isn't present, sexual trauma, um, civilian trauma. All of these can be addressed through these two therapies that I talked about today. Obviously, kind of different approaches depending on the experiences that are being discussed. Okay, any last questions from the chat here today? I'll wait. While I'm waiting to see if there's any other challenges or questions, I wanted to bring up one last thing about frost call before we wrap up here. So one of the biggest challenges when struggling with PTSD symptoms is feeling like you're alone. And oftentimes it feels like veterans are the only ones who can understand, like I mentioned earlier. And while I think it's important to educate civilians and to get support from civilians because they make up 99% of the country, we also have a program at Frost called designed specifically to help provide some support with other veterans in your community. It's called the Battle Buddy program and is a great way to try to get some connection, to get someone that you can talk to who can understand a little bit of your experiences. Even if they were a pogue versus combat versus Marines versus Army, it's still nice to have someone who understands kind of the nuts and bolts of the military experience. It's not a therapy service. It's not a big brother, big sister service. It's just another friend, someone who gets it to chat with, connect with, and feel like you have a little bit more of a personal connection among the other connections that you can form within the Frost Call community. So if you're interested or if you know someone who might be interested, check it out at frostcall.org/battlebuddy. They can check out the program. It's free. We have all kinds of cool stuff that we're trying to give away, get donations from others to give out to veterans. Veteran Battle Buddies always get first dibs on our upcoming events. So it is a great opportunity to kind of get involved, to get connected with another veteran in your community, and just kind of have someone to chat with. Again, not therapy. You can go to a professional for that. It's just someone you can connect with and feel understood for a little bit now and then. So check out the link in the chat if you're interested to know more. And I think that about wraps it up for today. Thank you everyone who came out to the talk today. I'll go ahead and have this link available for folks to check out at another time. But again, thank you for attending. I hope this has been helpful, especially for PTSD Awareness Month. I'm grateful that I get to work with the veterans that I do and support those in the Frost Call community. And I appreciate everyone who was able to check out this talk today. All right. Thank you all.